And now you know for whom the bell tolls. What? So I've just been informed that I can't actually get Eddie Munson to come in and play a Metallica cover for this particular video. Sorry guys. But today we're going to talk about the Thaumaturge class from the Dark Archive on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Happy Halloween, travelers and tourists. My name is Mark, and I am the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who is asking you to please refrain from exploiting my vulnerability to red velvet cake and snickerdoodle cookies. I have a sweet tooth, okay? Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today, we are returning to my classic introduction series and taking a look at the second new class that was released in the Dark Archive. Previously, we've taken a look at the Psychic class, and today we're going to be doing an introductory overview of the Thaumaturge class instead. The Psychic and the Thaumaturge are both classes that deal with the mysterious elements of the world, but they deal with them in very different ways. The Psychic is an occult spellcasting class, but the Thaumaturge is a martial class, or a skill-focused class. It doesn't rely on magical power to overcome mysterious foes, but rather the skill and quick thinking of the Thaumaturge is what gives them their advantage. Now, the Thaumaturge can be found starting on page 31 of the Dark Archive, and I will also have a link down in the video description so that you can check out this class on Archives of Nethys if you're interested. But today, we're going to examine the Thaumaturge through the lens of 5 questions that are a typical part of this series. We are going to ask and answer, what is the Thaumaturge? What are the Thaumaturge's strengths? What are the Thaumaturge's weaknesses? What build options does the Thaumaturge offer us? And finally, how can we get the most out of the Thaumaturge in play? So join me for a conversation about a fun and flavorful, though admittedly complicated class. But before we do all of that, please remember to attempt your standard DC esoteric lore checks in order to do all of that YouTube stuff like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to check out my free Discord and my Patreon. Both of those will be linked in the video description. And as always, the best thing you can do is to jump down into the comments section and be a part of the conversation. But with all that out of the way, let's get started. So today we're talking about the Thaumaturge, a class for Pathfinder 2nd Edition that can be found in the Dark Archive. Now, every time we do one of these classic introduction videos, we always use the same 5 basic questions as a framework for understanding the class that we're discussing, but every class is a little different in terms of where the focus is going to be, and I'll go ahead and tell you that the Thaumaturge is going to be one of those classes where we're going to spend a lot of time on the very first question of what is the Thaumaturge. Understanding what a class is and understanding the class's role is very important to being able to play the class successfully. And the Thaumaturge, while definitely a class that I love, is also a class that can be a little bit hard to wrap your head around. So let's dive into the question, what is the Thaumaturge, and break that discussion into our 3 typical components, where we talk about the class role, the class complexity, and the key terms associated with that class. In game terms, what is the Thaumaturge? Well, if you were being really specific to Pathfinder 2e, the Thaumaturge would be described as a charisma-based martial class, and I feel like that description is actually confusing and would be utterly useless if you're not willing to take the time to examine the nuance of what a Thaumaturge is. So, let's pause for a second. In Pathfinder 2e, classes often have one of 2 different structures as kind of a primary philosophy of how that class is built. You can have a caster or a martial character, and most classes are going to fit into one of these two frameworks. Technically, the Thaumaturge fits into the martial character framework, but like some other martial classes in Pathfinder 2e, I think it's important not to focus on that martial framework too heavily, because I feel like the Thaumaturge is actually a skill-based class. Much like the Rogue, much like the Investigator, certain martial classes in Pathfinder 2e, while certainly having plenty of martial capability, lean more heavily into what the class can do with its skills, and the Thaumaturge is definitely one of those. So while the Thaumaturge is a martial class, I think it's better understood as a skill-based class, and when you look at it that way, suddenly the idea that it is a charisma-based class makes a lot more sense. True martial-oriented classes are typically going to build off strength or dexterity. They're going to be very combat-focused. The Thaumaturge can hold its own in a fight, but that emphasis on mental stats kind of tells you that it is the skill side of the character sheet that is going to be critical to how well you do. So that was easy, right? Alright then, let's move on to class complexity. It will probably not surprise you to find out that I consider Thaumaturge to be one of the most complex classes in the game. I give the Thaumaturge an overall complexity rating of 8 out of 10, and honestly I consider it to be the third most complex class in this game. Only the Oracle and the Alchemist would I consider to be more complex or have more going on in terms of what a player needs to know and be prepared to handle. Now, as always with the complexity ratings in this series, please do not let a complexity rating scare you off of a particular character. I have seen brand new players to Pathfinder 2e take some of the most complex classes in the game and play them very effectively. Why? Because they were excited to do so. If you are interested in something, that excitement is always going to outweigh the complexity, so don't let complexity scare you off, just let it inform you of how much you need to be paying attention to if you choose this type of character. Okay, so we've determined that the Thaumaturge is a fairly complex, charisma-based, skills-oriented character, but what does that all mean? Well, in terms of gameplay, the Thaumaturge can be pictured as a class that focuses on finding, creating, and ultimately exploiting the weaknesses of a particular target. If you want to play a character that is really good at finding the chink in the armor, in finding the particular advantage that is necessary to take someone or something down, the Thaumaturge is a fantastic class for you. But with all of that in mind, now we move on to key terms, and it's probably not going to surprise you, there is a lot here. One of the cool things that Paizo does for every class in the game is they give you this handy sidebar that tells you some of the important terminology that you need to be aware of if you choose to play, in this case, the Thaumaturge. And if you've watched very many of these episodes, you also know that I frequently complain that Paizo doesn't point out enough stuff in these sidebars. That's definitely going to be the case here. The two key terms that they do give us are esoterica and temporary items. One of the major flavor elements of the Thaumaturge class is that as your character is traveling around, going on adventures, and just doing your usual journeys, that you are collecting things, that you are hoarding small objects, different items, but these aren't just regular objects or items, rather they are objects and items that have a spiritual weight to them. These things are referred to as esoterica. This could be old family jewelry or shavings of silver. This could be small pieces of religious art or berries gathered from a sacred grove. Truth be told, as a Thaumaturge, you probably have a lot of stuff that you are carrying, and this esoterica is going to power a lot of your abilities. In game terms, what this means is that if you want to use certain class abilities, you have to have your esoterica on you. Now, the general assumption of the game is you probably have your gear at all times, and that would also include your esoterica, So as long as it is a normal situation where you can access the things you've collected, your abilities will function normally, but do be aware that if you're in a situation where your gear and supplies have been taken away from you, certain class abilities may not function or may not function as well. The second key term that they give you is temporary items, and this is something that is probably exactly what you think it sounds like. As a Thaumaturge, you may gain the ability to create temporary items throughout the course of your adventures. And essentially in terms of game mechanics, what this means is temporary items are going to function long enough for you to use them in play, but are clearly not up to the same quality as a regular item, and as a result, temporary items are not the kind of thing that a Thaumaturge will typically be able to sell, trade, barter, or anything like that. Much like the infused reagents of the alchemist, these are temporary items for you to use, not for anybody else. Now, those are the two key terms that Paizo gives us in the sidebar, but there is definitely more that you are going to want to track if you're playing a Thaumaturge, and some of the key terms that you need to know are implement, implement empowerment, esoteric lore, exploit vulnerability, and intensify vulnerability. Now, implement is a reference to implements, which are a major class feature of the Thaumaturge. Essentially, these are items that are more powerful and more permanent than the lesser esoterica that your character carries, and we're going to talk about the implements in specific when we get to the build options portion of this video, because your Thaumaturge implements are really how you define your Thaumaturge subclass, so we're going to save implements for that portion of the video. However, with your implements, you also get an ability called Implements Empowerment, which basically represents the fact that while you have a weapon in one hand and your magical implement in the other, you can use this magical implement in various ways to enhance your attacks. Basically, Implements Empowerment is some bonus damage that you will get to add as a result of wielding your implement while you're in a fight. If it helps, think of it as a way of offsetting the fact that one of your hands is taken up by the implement that you are wielding. The next thing that we need to discuss is a class ability called Esoteric Lore. Esoteric Lore is a class-specific lore skill that you are automatically trained in and that will progress automatically as your character levels up. Eventually, Esoteric Lore will get all the way to legendary proficiency for your character. Esoteric Lore is a lore skill that can be used only as a means to recall knowledge about curses, haunts, and any creature in the game. Man, this is such a niche skill? Okay, so Esoteric Lore is a pretty cool benefit for the Thaumaturge, and I want to go ahead and mention you actually get to use your Charisma modifier instead of your Intelligence modifier with Esoteric Lore. So it's even a little bit more powerful, but basically just view this as a floating recall knowledge skill that is going to be useful against basically everything you encounter that is not a building or a location of some kind. And if the building is haunted, I guess you still get to use this lore. Could they just have called this, like, plot spoilers lore or something? I feel like that's basically what it is. But yes, Esoteric Lore is a recall knowledge skill that you're going to get a ton of use out of, and it is going to be useful anywhere that recall knowledge would show up. The main place that you're going to use it, though, is in combination with an ability called Exploit Vulnerability. Now, Exploit Vulnerability is a very complex thing that has a lot of moving parts, but the basic idea is this is an action where you pick out a target and attempt a recall knowledge check versus that target as you scramble around your person trying to find a piece of esoterica that your target is going to be weak to. Now, there are a couple of subterms you need to know here. One is called a mortal weakness and the other is called a personal antithesis. A mortal weakness represents a weakness that a creature already has. So if you're up against a troll and that troll is weak to fire, then for purposes of this class ability, it has a mortal weakness to fire. However, sometimes you will come up against creatures where you either don't know what their mortal weakness is or they don't have a particular weakness, in which case they can have what's called a personal antithesis, which is essentially a weakness that you invent for them. Some of these class abilities are kind of crazy. One of the examples that Paizo uses is if you were dealing with a slave driver, you might pull out a broken piece of chain and use that to create a personal antithesis to the enemy that you're facing. Essentially, if they don't have a specific weakness, you can make one up for them. Okay, so exploit vulnerability is an action that is going to allow you to potentially use either a mortal weakness or a personal antithesis against your foe. So, alright, now we get to talk about how this actually works. What you do is you roll esoteric lore against the creature in question, and depending on if you get a critical success, failure, or critical failure, you will have a different outcome from the check. Now, this is a recall knowledge check about the creature, so it will have the benefits associated with using recall knowledge on a creature. Don't forget that part. On top of that, with a critical success or a success, you automatically learn any resistance, weakness, or immunities that the creature has. Basically, that is a lot of bonus, very useful information. Then, on a critical success or a success, any attack with your weapon is going to deal bonus damage against that creature as if that weapon was targeting the mortal weakness or personal antithesis, your choice, of that creature. Okay, what does that mean? I have a regular old sword in this hand. I'm fighting a troll. I succeed on my exploit vulnerability check. Now, even though it is a completely regular sword, when I attack the troll, that sword counts as if it is dealing fire damage for purposes of how much damage it is dealing to the troll. I am exploiting its mortal weakness even though I'm not using fire damage myself. If I'm fighting a creature that doesn't have a mortal weakness, I can use the personal antithesis bonus instead. By the way, the personal antithesis bonus is just a simple 2 plus 1/2 your level bonus damage. It scales in a very predictable fashion, and you always have that option. Though essentially it will always be weaker than if the creature has an active mortal weakness of some kind. Now, what happens if you fail your exploit vulnerability? Well, you don't discover the weaknesses or mortal weaknesses that a creature might have, but you can still give that creature a personal antithesis, which you can then still apply when you are attacking the creature. However, there is a little bit of risk here. If you critically fail your check on exploit vulnerability, you become too distracted trying to find the right item on your person somewhere, and you are flat-footed as a result. Basically, you drop your guard while you're looking for something. So exploit vulnerability is essentially a way of attempting a recall knowledge check to gain information and bonus damage against an enemy. Hey guys, this is Mark from the future. I have to give a quick edit to something I said a moment ago. On a critical success, you learn every resistance, weakness, and immunity that the target creature has. On a regular success, you only learn the highest weakness that a creature has. You don't get the other extra information, though it's still a recall knowledge check, so you might get some of that information anyways. But anyways, this ability is kind of insane, and there's a lot of moving parts. Alright, so that is exploit vulnerability. What is intensify vulnerability? Well, essentially this is an action that you can use on the following round to make things worse for your target. You can't use intensify vulnerability and exploit vulnerability on the same round, but if it is a later round, you can present your implement and gain some kind of extra effect or benefit versus your target. However, it is important to note here, intensify vulnerability is very dependent on the specific implement that you are wielding, so this is kind of a conversation for subclasses rather than something that we need to dive into right here and right now. But okay, that is all of the key terminology that really goes into understanding exactly what a thaumaturge is and exactly what a thaumaturge does. We can move on to some more analytical questions. Let's talk about what are the strengths of the thaumaturge. Now earlier, I kind of dropped the number one strength of the Thaumaturge, so this probably shouldn't be a surprise if you were paying attention. The Thaumaturge is really, really strong in the skills department. The Rogue is the king of the skills in Pathfinder 2e, but the Thaumaturge is very, very solid. I would actually argue that the Thaumaturge may be slightly better than the Investigator. It could go either way, but skills is something a Thaumaturge is going to excel at, and if you are playing a Thaumaturge, this is one of the first areas where you want to really stop and analyze what your character has access to, because, well, it's just a lot. Okay, I guess I should be a little more specific here. A Thaumaturge at level 1 is going to begin trained in 4 specific skills: Arcana, Nature, Occultism, and Religion. On top of that, they will get an additional 3+ Intelligence modifier skill proficiencies, plus any bonus skill proficiencies that might come from their background or ancestry feats. And as the Thaumaturge levels up, they're actually going to get some free increases to those first 4 skills, Arcana, Nature, Occultism, and Religion. You will get a few free skill bumps in those skills just naturally as you level up. And don't forget, you also get that free esoteric lore skill that is automatically going to progress to legendary throughout the course of play. A level 1 Thaumaturge with a 10 in intelligence, no bonus to intelligence, is going to start the game proficient in at least half of the skills in Pathfinder 2e, and if you take the time to invest in intelligence at all, it's only going to get stronger. Pair that with the free skill bumps to some of your most important skills, and, well, the Thaumaturge is a beast in the skill department, though I do think we can dig a little bit deeper, and you may notice the Thaumaturge is a beast in the Recall Knowledge skill department. Esoteric Lore, Arcana, Nature, Occultism, Religion, all of these skills focus around the Recall Knowledge action, and the Recall Knowledge action is a huge part of what the Thaumaturge does. So when you are looking at the Thaumaturge, not only is it a skill beast, but it is a skill beast in the specific area of knowing stuff about your enemies. If knowledge is power and knowing is half the battle, the Thaumaturge is pretty well set up in this department, so expect skills to be one of the strongest parts of your character sheet. The second major strength that I want to talk about with the Thaumaturge is the Thaumaturge is really good at just stacking bonus damage onto their regular attacks. The Thaumaturge is a martial class, so it's going to get weapon specialization and greater weapon specialization just like your typical martial classes would, and those abilities are basically just bonus damage. But on top of that, you get the bonus damage from your exploit vulnerability. Mortal weakness, personal antithesis, doesn't matter. It's basically just free damage that your character gets to add on top of their regular attacks. The Thaumaturge is really good at just stacking all of this extra damage onto their regular hits. Depending on your Thaumaturge level, the typical Thaumaturge strike is going to deal anywhere from +2 to +18 bonus damage, and to put that in perspective, that damage is very comparable to most barbarians when they are raging and using greater weapon specialization. Now, a barbarian's bonus damage is anger and rage coursing through their bodies, whereas the Thaumaturge bonus damage is exploiting the weaknesses of your target. But saying that the Thaumaturge's bonus damage is on par with a lot of barbarian subclasses, not the giant subclass, but most of them, that's pretty impressive. So just be aware that as a Thaumaturge, one of the things you're going to be able to do is just kind of stack these nice little bonuses and damage increases onto your regular attacks, meaning your regular attacks are going to be pretty potent when you're making those strikes. The final strength that I want to talk about is maybe a little bit different from this channel, but it is something that I think is worth discussing, and that is just how fun and flavorful the Thaumaturge really is. The Thaumaturge is a very complex class, and I'm sure I've made that clear as I've gone through this video, But I want to stress that Paizo, in creating this class, has really made a martial class that can fill a lot of roles, that can do a lot of things. It is a class that has a lot of different options, and those options are pretty consistently entertaining. Like, the stuff the Thaumaturge can do is just fun. And I really like this about the class. Other classes you can get lost in this mechanical bonus, this niche of the rules, but with the Thaumaturge I consistently find myself thinking in terms of the story. And when you have a class whose mechanics support the story so well, I have to give props where props is due. Paizo did a good job of making the Thaumaturge not just mechanically viable, but very fun and flavorful in a way that helps you engage with the story. But so it doesn't feel like I'm just skipping out on talking about cool mechanical strengths, I will say that the Thaumaturge is one of my favorite classes in the game in terms of variety in the reaction department. Lots of classes have cool actions, but the Thaumaturge actually has some of the best variety, at least in my opinion, in the reactions department, and when we get to build options, I'll talk about why. But with every class, it's not always good news. Every class will display certain strengths, but every class will also come with certain weaknesses that you need to be prepared for if you want to play the class well. And the same is true of the Thaumaturge. Now, the first weakness of the Thaumaturge is fairly easy to identify, and probably one that longtime viewers of this channel are going to see coming. It is the MAD, multiple attribute dependency, of the Thaumaturge. Now, the Thaumaturge core ability is Charisma, and a lot of their abilities operate off of Charisma, but don't forget the Thaumaturge is a martial class. And that means that if you want to make melee strikes or range strikes, you need some strength or dexterity to do that. And then if you're going to be caught up in combat, you probably need the Constitution to be able to take some hits. And that says nothing of the fact that 4 of your starting skills, Arcana, Nature, Occultism, and Religion, all build off of Intelligence. You can kind of see how the Thaumaturge is one of those classes that needs a lot of different attributes and could end up kind of starving for attribute boosts if it's not careful. If you want to play a Thaumaturge, think very carefully about what aspects of the Thaumaturge you're going to focus on so that you can make sure that you are focusing your attribute boost in a way that is going to emphasize whatever it is you are doing with your character. Like some other classes in this game, the Thaumaturge is a little multiple attribute dependent, and that hunger for a multitude of attributes is going to be difficult from time to time. There is another resource that the Thaumaturge is hungry for as well, and that resource is, well, actions. The Thaumaturge is one of the most complex classes in terms of managing its action economy. Pathfinder 2e has great action economy, it's one of the best parts of the game, but Thaumaturge is one of those classes where the action economy of the class is a bit stretched thin. Exploit vulnerability takes an action. Intensify vulnerability takes an action. Switching out an implement that you have in your hands, that takes an action. There are a lot of small things that the Thaumaturge does that are going to eat into your action economy, and it is very easy to wind up in a scenario as a Thaumaturge where you got more stuff you want to do, but you don't have the actions to do it. And on top of that, you're also hungry for hands? Yeah, I was not expecting to have to make that part of this video. As a Thaumaturge, you have your weapon, you have your implement, and you have no other hands to hold stuff with. Which means that you may find yourself in situations where you're struggling to figure out what to hold, what to carry, what to present, what to leave behind. As a Thaumaturge, there's a lot of fiddly stuff to manage, and if you get lost in the management, you might end up with a poor experience on this class. But let's step back a bit, because multiple attribute dependency and struggling with action economy and managing what you've got in your hands, those are very nuanced and detailed things. I do want to take a big picture look at the Thaumaturge and talk about the fact that the Thaumaturge is a martial class that is, at least relatively speaking, a little weak on the defensive side. Now, I've seen a lot of commentary online about how the Thaumaturge can struggle offensively, and it is true, the Thaumaturge is limited to a one-handed weapon because they've got their implement in their other hand, but I feel like the bonus damage that the Thaumaturge stacks pretty easily, I feel like that helps offset the fact that you are wielding a one-handed weapon. So, offensively, I feel like the Thaumaturge is in a reasonable place. Defensively, though, I have my reservations. You're a multiple attribute dependent class, which means you probably are not pushing your dexterity or constitution nearly as well as you would want to, meaning you may lag behind other martial classes in your ability to avoid a hit or take a hit. And because you're a multiple attribute dependent class, that also means you're going to be hungry for bonuses to your saving throws. And something a lot of people may not realize is the Thaumaturge does not gain legendary proficiency in any saving throw. They cap out at Master with Fortitude and Will saves and only get Expert on Reflex. When you pair non-legendary saving throws with multiple attribute dependency and a hunger for ability boosts, you end up in a situation where a Thaumaturge may be failing saving throws a little more often than other members of their party. What this means is, while you are a martial class, you have to be careful because combat may wear on you a little bit quicker than it does the other members of your team, and if you're not careful, you might end up in a very bad spot because, well, those hits are just piling up a little too fast. Alright, so now that we understand the strengths and weaknesses of the Thaumaturge, let's talk a little bit about our build options, or what is commonly referred to as subclasses for the Thaumaturge. Now, the Thaumaturge, kind of like other classes in Pathfinder 2e, is going to have what you could consider a build-your-own subclass approach. In other words, you don't have distinct subclasses, but rather you have options known as implements that you get to combine and use to build your own unique approach to how you play the Thaumaturge. Thaumaturges come with a choice of 9 different implements that they can choose from, and each implement is going to have 3 different benefits associated with it: an initiate benefit, an adept benefit, and a paragon benefit. Additionally, each of your 9 possible implements is going to have a unique ability that is associated with the Intensify Vulnerability action. Now, Intensify Vulnerability you get automatically as you level up as a Thaumaturge, so regardless of what you pick or what order you pick, every implement that you have will eventually be able to use the Intensify Vulnerability action, so that's not something we have to think about too in depth here. But one thing you will need to keep in mind is when it comes to picking implements, you are going to pick 3 implements over the course of your career as a Thaumaturge, and each of those implements ultimately is going to reach a different level of proficiency. By the end of the game, you will have 1 Paragon level implement, a 2nd Adept level implement, and a 3rd Initiate level implement. So they will be at 3 different tiers, though you can use them interchangeably whenever you would like. So much of the variety in the Thaumaturge is asking which 3 implements you want and which level you want those 3 implements at. So even if you have 2 or 3 Thaumaturges who have picked the same combination of implements, they still might have a very different playstyle because of how they have prioritized those implements. Alright, so that means in building our own subclass, we need to understand what these 9 different implements are, what options they offer us, and allow me to say that there is so much in this particular area that I am skimming the surface on all 9 of the implements. My goal here is to give you a basic idea of the role that the implements play, help you kind of understand what they do, but if you're interested in an implement in specific, you will need to go in and read in more detail, because obviously there's going to be a lot more information. When it comes to understanding the 9 implements, there is a way I think you can sort them that makes them a little easier to approach. I like to divide the implements into 3 groups of 3 based on the idea of active implements, reactive implements, and passive implements. Some implements in the game are going to require you to spend actions to use them. Those are what I would consider active implements. Some implements in the game require you to spend reactions to use them, so again, reactive implements. And other implements don't really require you to spend actions or reactions. Their benefit is passive so long as you're actively wielding them. And I think when you look at the implements kind of in those 3 different categories, it helps your brain understand more how they are intended to be used, so that's how I would like to approach them. I'm going to start with the active implements, which are the chalice, the mirror, and the wand. Now, the chalice is essentially the healing-focused implement option for the Thaumaturge. If you're looking at your Thaumaturge as more of a support character, as a healer, as someone who can help their team out, this is an excellent option for you. You essentially have this chalice that fills with mysterious liquid, and you can use that liquid to grant people temporary hit points or possibly even heal damage that they suffer. And as you go into Adept and Paragon level benefits for the chalice, you will find that the chalice can offset conditions like bleeding and enfeebled and clumsy, different things like that. It is a very healing and support-oriented option. Spend some actions to help your team out. The second active implement, and arguably one of the most interesting, I'm not sure if it's the strongest, but it could be the most fun, it is the mirror implement. And the basic action of the mirror implement allows you to create a reflection of yourself 15 feet away, and this reflection of yourself perfectly mirrors anything that you're doing. So if you're over here swinging your sword, your reflection is swinging your sword too, and you get to decide if you're in this square or that square when it comes to determining what you're hitting. It's a very unique ability, and it really sets the Thaumaturge apart. There's not a lot of options in the game that mirror, haha punny, what this particular implement can do. But when you consider the mirror implement, you might want to consider it as a short-range teleportation or tactical maneuver-oriented implement, because that's kind of the stuff it does. You also get the ability, you can make your reflection explode and deal damage to people. There's some other fun stuff in here, but it's kind of that where am I on the battlefield aspect of the mirror that makes it truly exciting. Your final active implement is the wand, and when you pick the wand, you get to pick electricity, fire, or cold damage, and you get the abilities to spend 2 actions to fling magic with your wand. As the wand levels up, you will increase the range, increase the elemental options available, and potentially even add some debuff effects to your elemental strikes with the wand. It's basically a ranged attack option for the Thaumaturge that lets you mix a little bit of Blaster Caster into what you do. The next group of implements that you can pick from are what I'm going to call the reactive implements, and these are the amulet, the bell, and the weapon. The weapon is a reactive implement? Let's talk about it. So each of these implements are going to use up your reaction if you're using them inside of combat. First up is the amulet, which is your defense-oriented amulet. This is actually going to let your Thaumaturge play in a manner somewhat similar to a champion in terms of your ability to provide damage reduction to your team. Now, the Thaumaturge may not be as tough as your regular champion, and there are going to be some differences in how much damage they can mitigate, but one of the things I like about the amulet implement is as it levels up, you're going to gain the ability not just to give your party members resistance to damage, but give them a lingering resistance to damage. So imagine that your party is fighting a red dragon. You can use your amulet to give them fire resistance at a critical moment, but then you can also give them a lingering fire resistance that might be useful on future rounds. The amulet implement is a little bit straightforward, but it's pretty nice. It's basically your defense option as a Thaumaturge. Up next is the bell, And the bell is all about creating disruptive sounds. You spend a reaction to ring the bell and attempt to disrupt a strike or spell that your opponent is attempting. Now, there are a lot of crunchy particulars in how the bell works, so this is definitely one that you're going to want to read up on if this is something you're interested in. But when your enemy attempts to strike you, or when your enemy attempts to throw a spell at you, you can ring this bell to kind of try to interfere with what they're doing. Your enemy will get a save against your attempted disruption, but essentially the bell is a debuff as a reaction implement. That's cool. I think a lot of people are sleeping on the bell in general. A lot of the commentary I've heard kind of speaks low of the bell as a Thaumaturge implement, but I actually really like the bell because you get to debuff the exact thing your enemy is trying to do as a reaction. That is really nice, and in my opinion, it's a lot of fun. So if you like the idea of debuffing your enemies and burning reactions to do it, check out the bell. I think a lot of people have been sleeping on this implement. And then the last reaction-oriented implement is a weapon implement, and the weapon implement is intended to be an implement. It's in your offhand. It's not your main weapon. It is a side thing that you're wielding or holding. But what the weapon implement is going to do is kind of give you this weird version of attack of opportunity. It's called Implement's Interruption. It starts out as a slightly weaker version of attack of opportunity, but as it slowly upgrades, it becomes this interesting twist on attack of opportunity that can potentially disrupt actions a little bit easier than a normal attack of opportunity, and can even have a fail case. Your implement's interruption missed, but you still get to do something with it even though you missed. The Thaumaturge is a martial class, so if you want your Thaumaturge to have attack of opportunity, the weapon implement is the way to do it. It's not going to be a perfect mirror of attack of opportunity on a fighter, but it does a pretty good impression and adds some pretty good benefits as your weapon implement gets stronger. Our final group of implements are what I'm calling the passive implements. Now, to gain their benefits, you still must be wielding them. You need to have them in hand, they need to be active and out and in the open, but they're not going to burn an action or a reaction in order to gain their benefits. They just need to be present and accounted for when it comes to doing stuff inside the game. Your passive implement options are the Lantern, the Tome, and the Regalia. Now, the Lantern implement is another fairly simple and straightforward implement, though if I'm being honest, this is another one that I really enjoy. And essentially this will give you, as it levels up, an ever-growing radius of light because, I mean, it's a lantern, you'd expect that. But inside of this radius of light, you get a bonus to finding things as the light from your lantern begins to reveal things that might otherwise be hidden. As your lantern gets stronger, your enemies are going to take penalties to deception and stealth, and a particularly strong lantern implement has the ability to counter things like concealment, illusion magic, and transmutation magic. The lantern is going to show you what is really in front of you. It's pretty simple, it's pretty straightforward, but there are a lot of situations where I think an adventuring group would really love to have this. Your next passive implement option is called the Tome. The classic example here would be some kind of book that your character carries, though anything that could be used to record and convey information can qualify as a tome for purposes of this implement. And I don't think it would surprise anyone watching this video to hear that the Tome implement is all about, well, recall knowledge. It's going to give you bonuses to recall knowledge, it's going to help you find the information that you need. And one of the things I really enjoy about the Tome as an implement is it gives you 2 bonus skills. Any 2 bonus skills of your choice. You get to pick them, they're there, they're yours to use. You have a class that is already ridiculous in the skill department, and you have an implement option that just says, hey, here's some more. So you can kind of look at the Tome implement as a passive buff to your already strong skill game. On top of that, as your Tome gets stronger, you're going to get a fortune effect that comes with your tome. Now, it's not a true lucky reroll, it's more of a preemptive reroll that the tome gives you. But if you're looking for some buffs to your skill game, if you're looking for a few fortune effects to add to your character, the tome is a fantastic implement. The last general category of implement is called regalia, and this is associated with any kind of special item or article that would be used to convey authority, the classic example being like the scepter that a king might hold. The regalia implement is all about leadership, and most of its abilities will center around the follow the expert activity in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Now, follow the expert is almost its own set of rules, so you're probably going to have to do some reading to understand the full nuance of this, but essentially the regalia is going to make your team more effective when they are looking to you for leadership in a particular area. On top of that, the regalia, as it gets stronger, is going to start essentially giving you an aura of party buffs that you can pass out to your team. In this way, you kind of play a role similar to the bard. You're going to give your party bonuses against fear or mental effects. You might make it harder for your party to be flat-footed, and in some instances you might be able to give a bonus to damage or even to hit for your party members when they're attacking the same creature that you are. If you see your Thaumaturge as a leadership-oriented character, regalia could be a good choice for you. But at the end of the day, what you're going to do is you're going to take your choice of any 3 implements, and over the course of the game, level a few of those implements up until you have a unique collection of items and abilities that your Thaumaturge can bring to bear. Whew. Alright, almost done. We are on our last question: how can I get the most out of the Thaumaturge in play? And like most of the videos in this series, I want to focus in on 3 tips that I think will help you if you choose to play a Thaumaturge. And let's start by talking a little bit more about implement selection. One of the things that I think is critical to having a good experience with the Thaumaturge is mixing or picking your implements carefully. If we go back to the weaknesses section, you may remember I said that the Thaumaturge is an action-hungry class. And one of the mistakes I could see someone struggling with on the Thaumaturge is a collection of implements that all eat into the same resource. The mirror is really cool, the chalice is really cool, but both of those eat into your action economy. By the same token, the weapon and the bell both require your reaction. And in any case, all of them require a hand in order to use. So when you're thinking about your implements, you want to think about how those implements are going to work together or fit together in your overall strategy. Now, it is by no means required that you have to pick a Group 1, a Group 2, and a Group 3 implement. I'm going to have one active implement, one reactive, one passive. That is not a requirement in any way, but you do want to think about how each of these implements are going to interact with your action economy and your character choices, and you want to make sure that you are combining your implements in a deliberate way so that you are not overlapping or frustrating yourself in the costs associated with whatever you choose to use. The implements are, in my opinion, exciting, interesting. I think they can all lead to some very fun story beats and some very fun story options, but I would just caution you, be careful about what you pick and how you combine them, because not every implement is going to mix well with every other one. The second tip that I want to talk about with the Thaumaturge is going to sound familiar to anyone who has seen the Ranger video in this series, which is focus. This is actually a common tip for a lot of classes that have multiple attribute dependency, or for classes that can just go in a variety of directions. When you have a lot of choices in front of you, it is easy to get lost in the diversity of options. It's kind of like the implement issue that I just talked about. If you pick your implements in a haphazard fashion, you may find out that you don't like the resulting mix. Well, as a Thaumaturge, you have a lot of options in implements, in actions, in abilities, in ways you can approach the game, which means you want to think very strategically about how you're going to focus your character. Am I the party healer? Am I the party tank? Am I a damage dealer? What is my role in the party, and how can I make choices that are going to serve that role and serve it well? If I'm looking for strong offense, I might mix things like the wand and weapon implements, where if I'm looking to protect my team, I might mix things like the chalice and the amulet. The point is, I want to pick a particular strategy, and I want to make my choices with that in mind. The second thing I want to say on the subject of focus is, in addition to focusing on a strategy, you also want to focus on an enemy. Now this is kind of caught up in exploit vulnerability that we talked about a long time ago. Exploit vulnerability targets a particular creature. Gives you some good bonus damage, but it's just against that creature. Which means you really want to pick one enemy that is important to you, and you want to take out that enemy with extreme prejudice. Diversifying your attacks or splitting your attention between multiple foes at once is ultimately going to cut down on the overall effectiveness of your character, and much like a ranger, you kind of want to have one target in mind, and you want to focus the majority of what you're doing on defeating or overcoming that particular target before you switch to a different foe. And the last piece of advice, I will go ahead and admit, is stolen straight up from the Wizard video early on in this series, and that is, prior planning prevents poor performance. You are a recall knowledge-based class. You have pretty much every recall knowledge skill in the game, and you can certainly get every recall knowledge skill in the game if you want it. Recall knowledge is your bread and butter. So it is to your advantage to know the fight before you ever enter the fight. Research before you go after the enemy. Figure out what you can about their lair, about their tactics, about their abilities, and plan for whatever it is you're going to encounter. This is a fairly simple example, but if you know you're going up against a red dragon, having your amulet out and ready to protect your party from a fire breath weapon, even if you have a stronger implement in your arsenal, might be a good choice because you planned ahead and you know that that's a tactical element in the fight that's in front of you. Having a diversity of options is very powerful, but it doesn't do you much good to have that diversity of options if you're going to get caught off guard. So take the time, plan ahead, figure out what's in front of you, and come up with a strategy that's going to take you and your team to the end of the fight. Alright, so that covers all of our basic questions surrounding the Thaumaturge class. Obviously, there's a lot of details we haven't dived into. We haven't looked at things like class feats and some of the array of options that you can get, but that should give you a good starting point for understanding what the Thaumaturge is, what its strengths are, what its weaknesses are, how you can build it, and how you can use it well in play. Armed with this knowledge, you should be able to make some impactful choices and find some fun and impactful options inside of your campaign. But let me turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts on the Thaumaturge from Dark Archive? Do you agree with my analysis? Are there strengths that I overlooked or weaknesses that I failed to mention? And what are some of your favorite combinations from the 9 different implements that the Thaumaturge can choose from? I'm interested to see what combinations you would want to bring to bear. If you have any tips or tricks for the Thaumaturge, definitely leave those in the comment section as well. As always, I love to hear what you all have to say. Don't forget the other YouTube stuff. Like, share, subscribe, check out the Discord and Patreon, links in the video description. But as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.